The American dream: buy a car, have 2.5 children, 2 cars, buy a house, white picket fence, get a degree. They go through this whole thing, and then somewhere in their mid-30s to early 40s, they achieve all that shit, and then they're like, well, now what do I do? This wasn't nearly as satisfying as I thought it was gonna be. We easily, as humans, make the operating assumption that everyone else is thinking about us, when in fact, most people are only thinking about themselves. So it's crazy that we take things personal that is usually not personal, right? Everybody is optimizing for themselves inherently, and yet we care so much what other people think, and it shapes so much of what we do. And true freedom is figuring that out. So my whole first book that's coming out this year, and I'm very excited about, is on what I call the identity gap. I talk a lot about identity, and will continue to, because we don't see the world the way it is, we see the world the way we are. Our identity, our story about self, informs our worldview. Super fascinating. It also keeps us stuck more often than not. But this gap, the identity gap, is the difference between who we think we are and who we actually are. If God in her infinite wisdom said, yo, do you want to go run back your 20s? No, I'll pass. No need to go back and run that one back again. We spend most of our 20s, again, why I talk about the big three, fucking up the big three, because we are totally lost in the sauce. Why? Well, when we show up in the world, the behaviors we exhibit, the things we believe, are generally a culmination of our family environment, our culture, society, school, what we're told we're supposed to be. Very few of us give ourselves permission to be who we actually are. We show up in what we think we're supposed to be, and then we hate ourselves for it. Somewhere along the way, midlife crisis, more often than not, when I coach people that are going through that, what's happening is this is collapsing. They did all the shit that they were told to do, right? The American dream: buy a car, have 2.5 children, 2 cars, buy a house, white picket fence, the whole thing, right? Get a degree. They go through this whole thing, and then somewhere in their mid-30s to early 40s, they achieve all that shit, and then they're like, well, now what do I do? This wasn't nearly as satisfying as I thought it was gonna be. It wasn't the answer I was looking for. Now, what's happening? This ideal self is finally collapsing, and now we can get to who we really are. We owe this world who we truly are. Why this matters? Because when this gap is big, we don't have power. We're surrendering our power. We don't have an ability to create and change because we're living from a false identity. It's not who we actually are. When it collapses and we begin to live from our real self, everything changes, and we find that we have a hell of a lot more energy than we thought we did. Do you know how exhausting it is trying to keep up this facade? You're allocating all of this energy trying to live from this place. When you start to show up as you actually are, way more energy to actually begin to create in your world, because head and heart are now beginning to integrate. So this is really the work, and the faster you can get here, the better. How often do we exchange pleasantries with people that aren't real? How often do we say things on behalf of other people that we don't believe? How often do we keep our mouth shut when we really want to say something? Now, when you begin to show up as your real self, it can be very painful, because things in your life will begin to change, and that very often means people in your life begin to change. And you may go through what I call the dark winter, where your relationships, your social constructs begin to shift and to change, and you may find you go through a very lonely season, which is actually really important. People get stuck there though, because remember, we always do what we value most. And if we're afraid to do that, we may get stuck and revert back to the norm, because it becomes uncomfortable and we get lonely. Surrendering this is really tough, which is why when most people surrender it, it's because they had no other choice. When the pain of staying the same gets great enough, we change. Now, I get this from a human optimization standpoint. If I was to design humanity, I would design it with a deferring to changing because of pain, because it would ensure the species lives long enough to consciously ascend. But it's really frustrating that so much of our growth comes through immense pain. And I'm hoping within a generation, we will finally get to a point where we don't need pain to teach. But closing this gap is the work. For me, this is what it's really about. And I will probably spend the rest of my life talking about this and helping people do just this. How do we show up as our real self? If you enjoyed this video on relationships, you can check out more content like it in my playlist right here.